arrogant black belt mocked an old Vietnam's veteran at a boxing gym, calling him grandpa and daring him to step into the ring. "Come on, old-timer, show us what you've got," Leo sneered, his friends laughing behind him. In the corner, Arthur Vance sat silently, his faded duffel bag at his side, his pale blue eyes fixed on the young man with a calm that felt dangerous. At 74, Arthur looked frail, a relic in a world of muscle and swagger. No one knew he'd once been a legend. No one knew why he'd vanished decades ago, and no one was ready for what would happen next, when this quiet, forgotten man finally stood up. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. He carried the stillness of old battlefields into a world that had forgotten them. He just wanted a place to be quiet, but the gym's loudest voice decided the old man needed to be taught a lesson. The afternoon light struggled through the tinted, floor-to-ceiling windows of Apex Striking Academy, a name chosen for marketing reports and social media tags. It was less a gym and more a brand. Gleaming chrome, neon logos, and rows of pristine heavy bags hung like soldiers at attention. The air, thick with the smell of sweat and disinfectant, vibrated with the thump of electronic music and the sharp crack of shins hitting pads. Arthur Vance stood just inside the glass doors, a relic in this temple of the new. At 74, his shoulders were slightly stooped, not from weakness, but from the habit of carrying unseen burdens for half a century. He held a simple canvas duffel bag, its faded olive drab a stark contrast to the slick, branded gear everyone else carried. His face was a roadmap of deep lines, and his eyes, a pale, steady blue, took in the scene with a quiet intensity that saw everything and revealed nothing. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, his worn sneakers making no sound on the polished concrete floors. No one gave him a second glance. He was just an old man, out of place and invisible. At the front desk, a young woman with a bright, artificial smile and a headset was busy live-streaming her day at the desk. Behind her, a man in his late 30s leaned back in an expensive office chair, scrolling through his phone. This was Marcus Thorne, the owner. He had the manicured look of a man who sold fitness but didn't practice the discipline it required. His polo shirt was tight on his biceps, a little too tight, and a silver chain hung around his neck. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer was no. He didn't look up from his screen. "I'd like to join," Arthur said. His voice was raspy, low and calm. Marcus finally looked up, his eyes doing a quick, dismissive scan. He saw the cheap clothes, the old bag, the weathered face. "We have a waiting list for our advanced programs," he said, a polite lie to brush him off. "And our basic membership is $500 a month. Probably a little steep." Arthur just nodded. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet, counting out 5 $100 bills. He placed them neatly on the counter. The cash was old, soft, and creased. Surprised, and a little annoyed that his judgment was wrong, Marcus took the money. "Fine. Fill this out." He pushed a tablet and a stylus across the counter. "Don't hurt yourself, Grandpa." Arthur didn't react to the jibe. He painstakingly filled out the form, his large, calloused fingers moving slowly but precisely. He left the emergency contact field blank. He slid the tablet back, took the keycard Marcus offered, and walked toward the locker room. He found a spot on a bench in a quiet corner of the main training floor, a place where he could see the entire gym without being in the way. He didn't train. He just sat and watched. He watched the boxers, their movements flashy but inefficient, their guards sloppy. He watched the Muay Thai fighters, throwing powerful kicks, but leaving themselves dangerously exposed. He saw instructors correcting for aesthetics, for what looked good on camera, rather than for what was effective. They were teaching sport, not survival. Across the gym, a young man held court. This was Leo, the gym's prodigy. At 22, he was a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, a regional kickboxing champion, and the star of Apex's social media feed. He was handsome, athletically gifted, and deeply in love with the sound of his own voice. He moved with a peacock swagger, each perfectly executed kick or punch punctuated by a pose for the ever-present phones of his admirers. "And that's the difference between a master and a novice," Leo was saying to a small group of followers, demonstrating a complex spinning kick that ended inches from his training partner's head. It's about control, precision, art. He caught sight of Arthur sitting on the bench, a silent, unmoving figure in the corner. Leo smirked. "Yo, check it out," he said to his friends, loud enough for half the gym to hear. "Looks like the senior center is offering a field trip." A wave of snickers followed. Arthur's expression didn't change. His gaze shifted from Leo to a young woman struggling at the far end of the gym. Her name was Sarah. She was in her early 20s, and she moved with a frustrated, desperate energy. She had natural power, but her technique was raw, her movements hesitant. She was working a heavy bag, throwing combinations with all her might, but her feet were all wrong. She was off balance, telegraphing every move, and growing more discouraged with each sloppy punch. The coaches largely ignored her, focusing their attention on promising fighters like Leo or on clients who paid extra for private sessions. Hours passed. The gym's population swelled and then thinned. Arthur remained. As the evening wore on and the gym began to empty, he finally stood, stretching his back with a soft groan. Sarah was still there, her hands now wrapped around her knees as she fought to catch her breath, staring at the heavy bag as if it were an unbeatable enemy. Arthur walked over to the water fountain near her station. On the way back, he paused beside her. He didn't say a word, just stood there for a moment. Sarah looked up, startled. She had barely noticed the old man before. "Your back foot," Arthur said, his voice quiet. "You're letting it drift. It's stealing your power." Sarah stared at him, confused. He didn't look like a trainer. He looked like someone's grandfather who had wandered in off the street. But there was a calm authority in his voice, a certainty that made her listen. "Plant it," Arthur continued. "Turn your hip into the punch. The power doesn't come from your arm. It comes from the ground." He demonstrated, not by punching, but with a simple, slow-motion turn of his body. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement. But it was perfect. Sarah watched, then mirrored the motion. She planted her back foot, focused on her hip, and threw a right cross. The bag shuddered. The sound was different. Not a slap, but a deep, solid thud. It echoed in the nearly empty gym. Sarah's eyes went wide. "Whoa, it's just mechanics," Arthur said with the faintest hint of a smile. "Same today as it was 1,000 years ago." Before she could thank him, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Hey!" It was Marcus, striding over with a look of pure irritation. "Leave my clients alone. You're not a trainer here. Your membership doesn't cover giving unsolicited advice." Arthur had been absently tightening a loose strap on the heavy bag's anchor. He stepped back immediately. "My apologies," he said, giving a slight, respectful nod. "I meant no harm." Marcus's eyes narrowed. He looked from the old man to Sarah, then back. "You want to watch, you watch. You want to train, you train. You don't coach. We clear on that?" "Crystal," Arthur replied. His face was a placid mask. As Marcus walked away, muttering about liability, Sarah gave Arthur a grateful look. She returned to the bag, planting her foot just as he'd shown her, and the solid, satisfying thud echoed through the gym again and again. As closing time approached, the staff began their cleanup routine. Arthur approached Marcus, who was at the front desk, frowning at the day's revenue report. "Do you mind if I sweep up?" Arthur asked. Marcus grunted without looking up. "Knock yourself out." He assumed the old man was bored or looking for a handout. Arthur took a broom and began to sweep the massive training floor. He moved with a methodical grace, his work steady and thorough. He cleaned with the quiet diligence of a man who respected the space, even if the people in it didn't respect him. When the floors were clean and the last of the members had departed, he went to a dark corner of the gym, set down his old duffel bag, and began to warm up. He stretched slowly, his movements fluid, deliberate. Then, he began to shadowbox. The change was instantaneous and profound. The slightly stooped, slow-moving old man was gone. In his place was a fighter. His feet barely seemed to touch the floor as he moved, his head constantly slipping invisible punches. His hands, held loosely in front of his face, moved in a blur, tracing lethal patterns in the air. There were no flashy kicks, no wasted movements. Every block, every parry, every phantom strike was brutally efficient. It wasn't sport. It was the science of close-quarters combat, refined to its purest, most dangerous form. A young janitor, mopping the lobby, happened to glance through the glass doors and stopped cold, his mop clattering to the floor. He watched, mesmerized, as the old man moved with the deadly grace of a panther. The janitor stood there, frozen, until Arthur finished, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit, becoming just an old man again. Arthur paused at the door. He looked back at Marcus, who was now locking up his office. "You ever have real sparring in here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Marcus looked up, then laughed. "What? You want to get in the ring?" He called out to Leo, who was just leaving the locker room. "Yo, Leo, this old-timer wants to know if he can spar." Leo, toweling his hair dry, broke into a wide, arrogant grin. "You serious, Pops? You want to dance with me?" The few remaining staff members chuckled. Someone pulled out a phone, sensing a funny video in the making. Arthur didn't answer. He just gave a small, enigmatic smile, nodded goodnight, and walked out into the cool night air. The laughter followed him out the door, but it didn't seem to touch him. He was a man wrapped in a silence that no amount of noise could penetrate. The next day, Arthur returned at the same time. He paid no mind to the curious glances from the staff who had witnessed his shadowboxing or heard the story. He simply found his corner, sat on the bench, and resumed his silent observation. For him, this was a ritual, a form of meditation. The gym, with its raw energy and predictable rhythms, was a place he could understand. It was loud, but it was a simple kind of loud. It was a world of cause and effect, of action and reaction. It was, in its own way, peaceful. He watched Sarah again. She was practicing the footwork he'd shown her, her movements more confident, more powerful. The thud of her punches on the heavy bag had become a consistent, authoritative sound. A few other members, the more serious ones who cared more about technique than trends, started to notice. They'd watch her for a moment, a flicker of respect in their eyes. She was getting better, and she was getting better fast. Leo noticed, too. He was holding court by the sparring ring, boasting about a recent victory. He saw Sarah land a particularly sharp three-punch combination. "Looks like Sarah's finally getting it together," one of his friends commented. Leo scoffed. "Yeah, Marcus must have given her a few pointers. She's still got a long way to go before she's on my level, though. Look at her guard. It's wide open." He raised his voice. "Hey, Sarah, keep that left hand up unless you want to eat canvas." Sarah flushed, startled by the public criticism. She tightened her guard, but the interruption broke her rhythm. She shot a frustrated glance toward Leo, who just laughed and turned back to his audience. Arthur watched this exchange, his expression unreadable. He saw the flaw Leo pointed out, but he also saw the reason for it. Sarah was so focused on generating power from her feet, as he had instructed, that she was forgetting the fundamentals of defense. It was a classic beginner's mistake. He made a mental note. For the rest of the week, the pattern continued. Arthur would arrive, sit, and watch. He'd exchange a quiet, respectful nod with Sarah, who now looked for him every time she came in. At the end of the day, after most had left, he would take up a broom and clean the floors, his movements a quiet rebuke to the careless entitlement of the younger members. Then, in the solitude of the near-empty gym, he would train. His shadowboxing was a secret language, a conversation with ghosts only he could see. His presence began to create a subtle shift in the gym's atmosphere. He became a fixture, a silent, unassuming landmark. The members gave him a nickname, the janitor. It started as a joke, a way to dismiss the old man who swept the floors. But for a few, the name began to take on a different, almost mythical quality. They had seen him move when he thought no one was watching. They had heard the stories from the night staff. They looked at his calm, steady eyes and wondered what was behind them. The tension was a low hum beneath the gym's loud music, a string being slowly, inexorably tightened. One evening, Sarah was sparring with another female member. Her opponent was more experienced, and Sarah was getting frustrated. She was faster, stronger, but she kept getting caught with simple counterpunches. Her coach, a young, disinterested trainer who was more focused on his phone, offered useless advice. "Just be more aggressive, Sarah. Go get her." During a break between rounds, Sarah sat on a stool in her corner, breathing heavily. Arthur, who had been sweeping nearby, set his broom against the wall and walked over. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up a water bottle and handed it to her. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. "She's timing me," Sarah said, more to herself than to him. "Every time I throw my right, she comes over the top with her left hook." Arthur nodded. He looked at her opponent, then back at Sarah. "You're pulling your right hand back too slow," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a long trip home. You're leaving the door open." He tapped his own chin. "After you punch, the hand comes right back. The shortest distance. Don't admire your work." Then he added one more thing. "And you're headhunting. The head moves. The body doesn't." He tapped his side. "Go to the body. The head will follow." He gave her another nod, picked up his broom, and walked away just as the bell rang for the next round. Sarah went out with a new focus. She threw her right hand and, instead of letting it drop, snapped it back to her chin with lightning speed. Her opponent's counter hook whistled past empty air. A moment later, Sarah feinted a jab to the head, and as her opponent raised her guard, Sarah pivoted and drove a vicious right cross into her ribs. The sound was a sickening thud. Her opponent gasped, the air driven from her lungs, and her hands dropped. Sarah followed up with a simple, clean left hook to the jaw. Her opponent stumbled back against the ropes, dazed. The young coach, startled from his phone, jumped into the ring to stop the fight. The gym fell silent. Everyone had seen it. The clean, professional combination. The sudden, brutal efficiency. Sarah stood in the center of the ring, her chest heaving, more surprised than anyone. She looked over at Arthur. He was already sweeping again, his back to her, as if nothing had happened. But she saw him pause for a fraction of a second, and she knew he had been watching. Leo had been watching too. His face was a thundercloud of jealousy and wounded pride. This was his gym. He was the star. People were supposed to be watching him. He saw the looks of admiration being directed at Sarah, and he heard the whispers. He knew that the advice hadn't come from her useless coach. It had come from the old man. He strode over to Arthur, his entourage trailing behind him like pilot fish. "What did you say to her?" Leo demanded, his voice sharp and accusatory. Arthur stopped sweeping. He leaned on the broom and looked at Leo. His gaze was steady, calm, and utterly unimpressed. "I told her to protect herself," he said simply. "You're not a trainer," Leo snapped, puffing out his chest. "You're the janitor. You have no right to interfere. You could have gotten her hurt." "She was already getting hurt," Arthur replied, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. "She was getting hit with the same punch, over and over. Now she's not." The logic was undeniable, and that only made Leo angrier. He was used to being the authority. He was the black belt, the champion. This old man, this nobody, was making him look foolish in his own gym. "You think you know something about fighting, old man?" Leo sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Sweeping floors and watching from the sidelines doesn't make you a sensei." He took a step closer, invading Arthur's personal space. The air crackled. The music seemed to fade into the background. Everyone in the gym was watching now. "I know a few things," Arthur said, his eyes never leaving Leo's. "Oh yeah." Leo laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Like what?" "How to use a dustpan. How to change a light bulb." He gestured around the gym. "This is the real world, Pops. This is a science. This is for athletes, not for whatever you are." Marcus Thorne, seeing the confrontation, hurried over. But he wasn't there to de-escalate. He was there to back his star pupil. "Leo's right," Marcus said, standing beside his prize fighter. "You've been told once before, Arthur. You're here to work out or get out. And since all you do is sit around and sweep, I'm thinking it's time for you to get out. Your membership is revoked." Arthur looked from Marcus to Leo. He saw the smug, triumphant look on their faces. He saw the circle of gym members, their phones all pointed at him. He saw Sarah in the ring, a look of horror and concern on her face. He took a slow breath. He set the broom carefully against the wall. Then he turned his full attention to Leo. "You talk a lot about control," Arthur said, his voice clear and resonant in the suddenly quiet gym. "About precision. Art." He took a small step forward, and for the first time, Leo felt a flicker of uncertainty. The old man's placid demeanor had been replaced by something else, something ancient and dangerous. "You're not an artist. You're a performer. You train for points. For applause." Arthur's gaze was like a physical weight. "You don't know the difference between a sport and a fight." Leo's face turned crimson with rage. This was the ultimate insult. He was a champion. He had trophies. He had a record. He had followers. "Is that a challenge?" Leo spat, his voice trembling with fury. "Because I would love to teach you the difference. Right here, right now." He started pulling on a pair of sparring gloves. No headgear. No rounds. Let's see what you've got, janitor. Marcus grinned, sensing a viral moment. Yeah, Arthur. Show us what you know. Arthur looked at the ring, then at Leo's gloved hands. He slowly shook his head. I don't want to hurt you, son. The condescension in his voice was the final spark. Leo exploded. Hurt me? You old fossil. I'll break you in half. He bounced on the balls of his feet, filled with a furious, arrogant energy. Get in the ring. Or are you just a coward on top of everything else? Arthur stood motionless for a long moment. The entire gym held its breath. The silence was absolute. He looked at Leo's youthful, angry face, and for a fleeting instant, his own eyes were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a man who had seen too much violence, who had waded through oceans of it, and had hoped to never feel its pull again. But some things, it seemed, you could never outrun. He unzipped his old canvas duffel bag. He didn't pull out gloves or hand wraps. He simply took off his worn-out sneakers, placing them neatly beside the bag. Then, in his socks, he walked slowly toward the sparring ring, slipped between the ropes, and stood in the center, waiting. The entire gym went silent. The silence in the gym was a living thing, heavy and absolute. The thumping bass of the sound system had been cut off, leaving only the faint hum of the overhead lights. Every eye was locked on the two figures in the ring. It was a tableau of contrasts. Youth and age, arrogance and stillness, the peacock and the stone. Leo bounced on his toes, shaking his arms loose. He was in his element. The ring was his stage, and he had an audience. He sneered at Arthur, who stood perfectly still in the opposite corner, his hands held loosely at his sides. He wasn't even in a fighting stance. He was just standing there, breathing. You're going to regret this, old man, Leo spat. I'm going to make an example out of you. Arthur didn't respond. His pale blue eyes were fixed on Leo, but they weren't looking at his face. They were looking at his feet, his hips, his shoulders. He was reading the boy like a book he'd read 1,000 times before. Marcus, standing ringside, yelled, Finish him quick, Leo. Someone else wolf whistled. The small crowd of onlookers, phones held high, pressed closer to the ropes, hungry for the spectacle. Leo decided to give them one. He opened with his signature move, a flashy, lightning-fast tornado kick. It was a move that had won him trophies, a spinning, aerial assault that was as beautiful as it was intimidating. He launched himself into the air, his body a blur of controlled violence. For the crowd, it was an explosion of motion. For Arthur, it was a slow, predictable sequence of tells. He saw the dip of Leo's shoulder an instant before the kick began. He saw the shift in weight to the plant foot. He saw the telegraph of the turn. As Leo's foot sliced through the air where Arthur's head had been, Arthur was no longer there. He hadn't ducked. He hadn't jumped back. He had simply taken one small, precise step to the side. It was a movement of inches, utterly efficient, and it made all of Leo's explosive effort completely useless. Leo landed awkwardly, his momentum carrying him off balance. He stumbled, catching himself on the ropes, his back now turned to Arthur. The crowd gasped. The perfect, graceful champion had almost tripped over his own feet. Humiliation burned in Leo's cheeks. He spun around, his face contorted with rage. You got lucky, he screamed. He charged forward, throwing a flurry of punches, fast, crisp, textbook jabs and crosses. They were the kind of punches that looked great on a heavy bag. Arthur's hands came up, not in a rigid guard, but in a fluid, moving shield. He didn't block the punches, he redirected them. A slight turn of the wrist here, a subtle tap of the palm there. Leo's gloves slid past Arthur's head, glancing off his shoulders, never once making solid contact. It was like watching a man try to punch water. Arthur's feet barely moved. He swayed and shifted, a tree bending in a storm, his roots anchored to the canvas. Leo threw punch after punch, his frustration mounting with each miss. He was faster, stronger, younger. He was a champion. Why couldn't he hit this old man? He was breathing heavily now, his movements becoming wilder, sloppier. He's playing with you, Leo, someone in the crowd shouted, followed by a ripple of laughter. The laughter was like fuel on a fire. Leo let out a roar of pure fury and threw a wild haymaker, a looping right hand with all of his weight and anger behind it. It was a knockout punch, a desperate, undisciplined blow. This time, Arthur didn't parry. He didn't slip. He moved into the punch. In the split second that Leo's arm was extended, Arthur stepped inside the arc of the blow. He raised his left arm, not to block, but to guide the punch past his ear. At the same time, his right hand, open-palmed, shot forward. It wasn't a punch. It was a short, sharp, almost casual strike. It connected with Leo's solar plexus. The sound was nothing like a glove hitting a body. It was a dull, wet thump. All the air in Leo's lungs vanished in a single, silent explosion. His eyes went wide with shock and pain. His body went rigid. His forward momentum stopped, as if he had run into a brick wall. A strangled gasp escaped his lips. His powerful, athletic body, which had been a whirlwind of motion just a second before, was suddenly a statue. Arthur was already retracting his hand as Leo's knees buckled. He caught the younger man by the bicep before he could fall, holding him up. He leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly whisper meant only for Leo. "The fight was over before you threw your first kick," he said. "You move when you want to. A fighter moves when he has to. There's a difference." He held Leo for a moment longer, letting the pain and the lesson sink in. Then, he gently lowered him to the canvas. Leo curled into a fetal position, gasping for air, his face pale and slick with sweat. He wasn't beaten. He was broken. The gym was a tomb. The phones that had been held high to record a humiliating beatdown were slowly lowered. The smirks and laughter were gone, replaced by expressions of pure, unadulterated shock. They had not just seen an old man win a fight. They had seen a master dismantle an expert. They had witnessed two completely different languages of violence, and one had just proven the other to be nothing more than noise. Marcus Thorne stared, his mouth hanging open. His star fighter, his cash cow, was a wheezing, crumpled heap on the floor. And the old man, the janitor he had just tried to throw out, stood over him, not even breathing hard. Arthur stood in the center of the ring, alone, still figure in the sea of silence. He looked down at Leo, not with triumph, but with a deep, profound sadness in his eyes. He had not wanted this. He had not come here for this. This was a ghost he had been trying to outrun his entire life. He looked out at the stunned faces in the crowd. Their shock would soon turn to questions. He knew what would come next. The whispers, the stories, the unwanted attention. His peace was shattered. Without another word, he stepped between the ropes. He walked over to his corner of the ring, picked up his worn-out sneakers, and then walked to his old canvas duffel bag. The crowd parted for him as he moved, a silent, fearful wave. He didn't look at any of them. Sarah was standing near the door, her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with tears and awe. As Arthur passed, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. He gave her the slightest of nods, a silent acknowledgement, and then he was gone. He walked out the glass doors and disappeared into the anonymity of the evening, leaving behind a gym filled with the deafening sound of silence and a question that hung in the air like smoke. Who was that man? For a full minute after the glass door swung shut behind Arthur, the gym remained frozen in time. The only sound was Leo's ragged, painful gasps as he struggled to get his wind back. The sight of their champion, the untouchable black belt, curled on the canvas like a child, was so fundamentally wrong that it broke their understanding of the world. Marcus Thorne was the first to snap out of it. Panic and fury warred on his face. He rushed to Leo's side, not out of concern, but to assess the damage to his investment. "Leo, get up. Are you okay? Get up." Leo just groaned, waving a weak hand. The physical pain in his solar plexus was already fading, but it was being replaced by a deeper, colder agony, humiliation. He had been taken apart, effortlessly, in front of everyone. The video of his perfect tornado kick, now a symbol of his failure, was still on dozens of phones. The gym members finally began to stir, breaking into a chorus of hushed, incredulous whispers. "Did you see that? He didn't even punch him." It was like a magic trick. 1 second Leo's throwing a knockout, the next he's on the floor. Who the hell was that guy? The question rippled through the crowd. The janitor, the quiet old man who swept the floors. They looked at the broom still leaning against the wall, as if it were some kind of mystical artifact. Marcus, realizing the PR disaster unfolding, started damage control. "All right, show's over. Everybody back to your workouts. Now." His voice was shrill, lacking its usual authority. No one listened. The spell was broken, but the aftermath was far more compelling than any workout. He turned his anger on the staff. Somebody get him some water. And you, he jabbed a finger at the young janitor who had witnessed Arthur's shadowboxing. Go check the security cameras. I want every angle of that old man. Name, address, everything. He signed a waiver, but I'm going to ruin him for this. While the staff scrambled, Sarah walked over to the ring. She looked down at Leo, not with the awe she felt for Arthur, but with a flicker of pity. He looked small and lost. Then she looked at Marcus, her expression hardening. You forced him to do that, she said, her voice clear and steady. You and Leo. You cornered him. You mocked him for weeks. This is your fault. Marcus whirled on her, his face red. My fault. That old lunatic assaulted my top fighter. He's lucky we don't call the cops. Assault. Sarah scoffed, her voice rising. Leo challenged him. Leo threw the first punch. And the second, and the third. Arthur just finished it. He didn't even want to fight. A few other members nodded in agreement, murmuring their assent. They had all seen it. They had all heard Leo's taunts, Marcus's goading. The narrative Marcus was trying to spin was already falling apart. Defeated, Marcus stormed off toward his office to check the membership files. He pulled up Arthur Vance's digital form. It was sparse. Name, Arthur Vance. Age, 74. Address, a P.O. box in a town 30 miles away. Phone number, disconnected. Emergency contact, blank. He had paid in cash. For all intents and purposes, the man was a ghost. He had walked in from nowhere and returned to it. Meanwhile, Arthur walked through the cooling twilight. The city lights were beginning to glitter, but he barely noticed them. He didn't walk with the triumphant stride of a victor, but with the heavy, measured pace of a man carrying a familiar burden. The brief, brutal efficiency in the ring had woken things up inside him, memories and feelings he had spent decades trying to bury. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind the hollow ache of regret. He hadn't felt anger toward the boy. He had felt a tired pity. He saw in Leo's arrogant swagger the same blind confidence he had seen in countless young men, boys really, sent into the jungle so long ago. Boys who thought they were invincible, right up until the moment they weren't. His route was simple, leading him away from the busy commercial district and into a quieter, older part of the city. He stopped at a small, unassuming brick building with a simple sign out front. Veterans of Foreign Wars, Post 78. Inside, the light was dim, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and old wood. A few other old men sat at the bar or at small tables, nursing drinks in companionable silence. They were men like him, men who wore their history in the lines on their faces and the quiet in their eyes. No one asked questions here. No one needed to. He took a stool at the far end of the bar. The bartender, a fellow Vietnam vet with a prosthetic leg, nodded a greeting. The usual, Artie? Arthur nodded. Please, Frank. Frank placed a glass of ice water and a bottle of club soda on the bar. Arthur didn't drink. He had seen what alcohol did to men who were trying to drown their ghosts. It only taught the ghosts how to swim. He sat there for hours, the quiet hum of the bar a balm on his frayed nerves. He wasn't thinking about the gym, about Leo or Marcus. He was thinking about a lifetime ago. About the suffocating heat of a jungle canopy. About the weight of a ruck on his back and a rifle in his hands. He was thinking about the specialized training he had received, a brutal curriculum designed not for sport, but for survival at all costs. Close quarters combat. The art of silent, swift neutralization. Skills you were never supposed to use in the civilized world. Skills that, once learned, were impossible to forget. They became a part of you, a dark stain on your soul. He had come home from that war with a chest full of medals he never wore and a head full of memories he could never escape. He had tried to build a quiet life, a life of peace, to atone for the violence of his youth. He worked simple, solitary jobs. He kept to himself. He asked for nothing. And for 50 years, he had succeeded. Until tonight. Tonight, the ghost had gotten out. Back at Apex Striking Academy, the atmosphere was funereal. Leo had showered and changed, but he couldn't wash away the humiliation. He sat on a bench in the locker room, staring at his hands. These hands had won him trophies. They were registered as weapons, and they had been useless. He replayed the fight in his mind. The old man's movements. The way he had stepped into the punch. The calm, sad look in his eyes. You don't know the difference between a sport and a fight. The words echoed in his head, a damning verdict on everything he had built his identity upon. His art, his precision, his control, it had all been a performance. A dance. The old man hadn't been dancing. He had been ending a threat. The gym was different the next day. The story had already spread. People who had memberships but rarely showed up were there, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary janitor. New faces peered through the windows. Marcus tried to capitalize on the buzz, telling a wild, exaggerated story where Leo had slipped and the old man had taken a cheap shot. But the video clips were already circulating online. They were grainy and shot from a distance, but they all showed the same thing: an arrogant champion being effortlessly and completely dismantled. Sarah was there, training with a new intensity. She ignored the whispers and the drama. She just focused on what Arthur had told her. Plant the foot. Turn the hip. The hand comes right back. Go to the body. Her movements became cleaner, more efficient. She was no longer just hitting the bag. She was fighting it. Other serious students started to watch her. They saw the simple, brutal economy of her new style. They started to incorporate it themselves, abandoning the flashy, high-risk techniques for a more grounded, fundamental approach. A quiet revolution was beginning, sparked by a man who wasn't even there. A week passed. Arthur did not return. His locker remained empty. His quiet corner on the bench was unoccupied. The broom leaned in its usual spot, untouched. His absence was a bigger presence than his presence had ever been. Marcus grew more and more agitated. The buzz was fading, replaced by an uncomfortable reputation. His gym was now known as the place where the champion got flattened by a 74-year-old janitor. Membership renewals slowed. One afternoon, a man walked into the gym. He was in his late 60s, with a military-style haircut and a crisp suit that did nothing to hide a powerful, athletic build. He moved with an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He bypassed the front desk and walked directly to Marcus's office. "I'm looking for Arthur Vance," the man said. His voice was calm, but it was not a request. "Who's asking?" Marcus asked, trying to sound tough. The man placed a business card on the desk. It was stark white, with nothing but a name, a phone number, and an official-looking seal. "My name is Colonel John Miller, U.S. Army, retired. I was Arthur's commanding officer a long time ago. A mutual friend from the VFW post said there was some trouble here. Is he all right?" Marcus stared at the card, then up at the colonel's hard, unblinking eyes. Suddenly, he felt very small. This wasn't just some old man he had bullied. This was someone with a history that was now walking into his gym in the form of a retired Army colonel. "Trouble?" Marcus stammered. No trouble. He just stopped coming." Colonel Miller's eyes narrowed. "Arthur doesn't just stop coming anywhere. He's a man of routine. Something happened here. I'd like to know what." Colonel Miller's presence seemed to suck the air out of Marcus's cramped office. His calm, unwavering gaze was more intimidating than any physical threat. Marcus, who built his brand on projecting an image of alpha male confidence, found himself stammering like a schoolboy caught cheating. "Look, Colonel." "Sir," Marcus began, trying to regain some semblance of control. "There was a misunderstanding. A disagreement in the ring. Your friend, Mr. Vance, he's a tough old guy. My fighter, Leo, he underestimated him. That's all." The colonel's expression didn't change. It was a look of profound disappointment. Arthur Vance hasn't been in a disagreement in the ring in over 50 years. He went to Vietnam as a boy and came back as something else. He was part of a special operations group. Long-range reconnaissance patrol. LRPs. They were ghosts. They went places no one else would go, did things no one else could do. Miller leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "The men I sent on those missions, they were the best I ever saw. The quietest. The most disciplined. They were trained to end a conflict with the least amount of energy necessary. What you call a fight, they called clearing a room. Do you understand the distinction I'm making, Mr. Thorne?" Marcus swallowed hard. The image of the quiet old man sweeping floors shattered and was replaced by something far more formidable and terrifying. The effortless way he had dispatched Leo suddenly made a chilling kind of sense. It wasn't a lucky shot. It was muscle memory. "He saved the lives of 5 of my men, including my own," the colonel continued, his voice now laced with a cold anger. "He dragged me half a mile through a rice paddy with a bullet in my leg and 2 in his own, all while under enemy fire. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for that action. Not that he'd ever tell you. He came home and buried that part of his life. He has spent half a century looking for peace. I can't imagine what you and your champion fighter must have done to make him bring the ghost out of the jungle. The shame hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about the weeks of casual mockery, the condescending grandpa, the final, public humiliation of revoking Arthur's membership. He and Leo hadn't just disrespected an old man. They had desecrated a hero's sanctuary. Where can I find him? Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question wasn't about legal liability anymore. It was about the sudden, crushing weight on his own conscience. The colonel stared at him for a long moment, then seemed to arrive at a decision. He wrote an address on the back of his card. It was the VFW post. He deserves an apology, Mr. Thorne. A real one. Not for your business, but for your soul. Colonel Miller left as quietly as he had arrived, leaving Marcus alone in his office with the echoing silence and the heavy truth of his actions. The colonel found Arthur exactly where he expected to, at the quiet end of the VFW bar. The two men didn't greet each other with handshakes or boisterous hellos. They were past that. They simply shared a look of mutual understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the fires of a forgotten war. Frank told me you were here, Miller said, taking the stool next to Arthur. Also told me you haven't been sleeping. Arthur swirled the ice in his glass of club soda. Old habits, he said, his voice raspy. I went to that gym of yours, Miller said. Met the owner. A real piece of work. He told me what happened. Arthur sighed, a deep, weary sound. I lost my temper, John. I let him get to me. I haven't done that in a long time. From what I hear, you didn't lose your temper, Artie. You used it. There's a difference, the colonel countered gently. You taught a lesson that needed teaching. He was just a kid, Arthur murmured, staring into his glass. A proud, foolish kid, just like we were. I saw his face afterwards. I broke something in him. Not his ribs. Something deeper. Maybe something that needed to be broken, Miller suggested. Pride. Arrogance. Some things have to be torn down before you can build something better. The two men sat in silence for a while, the comfortable silence of old friends who understood each other's scars. Why the gym, Artie? The colonel finally asked. Of all the places in the world, why there? You hate noise. You hate crowds. Arthur took a slow sip of his soda. He looked at his own hands, the large, gnarled knuckles, the web of scars across them. I'm getting old, John. The body starts to forget. But the memories, they get clearer. I thought maybe if I was around the noise, the energy, the fight, but as a spectator, I could make peace with it. Watch it from a distance. See it as a sport, not what we did. I thought I could finally put the ghost to rest. He looked up at his friend, his pale blue eyes filled with a lifetime of pain. But the ghost doesn't want to rest. It just wants to be quiet. Back at Apex Striking Academy, the quiet revolution continued. The videos of the fight, though mostly taken down by Marcus in a panic, had been seen by enough people. The story had taken on a life of its own. Arthur Vance was becoming a legend, the Zen janitor of Apex. Leo came back to the gym a few days later. He was different. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, brooding intensity. He didn't hold court. He didn't showboat. He went to the far corner of the gym, to the oldest, most beat-up heavy bag, and he just worked. He wasn't practicing his flashy kicks. He was practicing the basics. A simple jab, a right cross, footwork. He was trying to deconstruct everything he knew, to find the flaws, to understand the brutal truth of what Arthur had told him. You don't know the difference between a sport and a fight. Sarah approached him cautiously one afternoon. Are you okay? She asked. Leo stopped, breathing hard, sweat dripping from his face. He looked at her, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only a raw, honest confusion. No, he said. I'm not. Everything I thought I knew about fighting was wrong. He took me apart, and he wasn't even trying. He shook his head in disbelief. He was trying not to hurt me. That's what I don't get. He had me. He could have broken my jaw, my ribs, anything. He just stopped me. He looked around the gym, at the students still practicing the flashy, inefficient techniques he himself had taught them. We're learning how to score points, he said, his voice filled with a newfound disgust. We're not learning how to protect ourselves. He was right. We're performers. It was a confession, a surrender of the ego that had defined him. It was the beginning of a transformation. That evening, Marcus Thorne did something he hadn't done in years. He left his office, walked out onto the main floor, and simply watched his members train. He didn't look at the revenue projections or the social media analytics. He looked at the people. He saw the flaws. He saw the potential. He saw the gap between what he was selling and what was real. The colonel's words echoed in his head. He deserves an apology, not for your business, but for your soul. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he drove to the address the colonel had given him. He walked into the quiet, dim VFW post, feeling completely out of place in his expensive polo shirt and designer jeans. He saw Arthur at the bar, and for a moment, fear made him want to turn and run. But he took a deep breath and walked forward. He stood beside Arthur, waiting. Arthur slowly turned his head, his face impassive. "Mr. Vance," Marcus began, his voice unsteady. I came to apologize. For my behavior. For what I said. For what I allowed Leo to do. There's no excuse for it. I was wrong. And I am deeply, truly sorry." Arthur looked at him, his gaze searching. He saw the fear in Marcus's eyes, but he also saw something else. Genuine remorse. "The boy," Arthur said. "Leo, how is he?" The question surprised Marcus. "He's humbled. Confused. He's training differently. He's trying to understand." Arthur gave a slow nod. "Good. Understanding is the beginning of wisdom. I'd like to give you your money back," Marcus said, pulling an envelope from his pocket, "and offer you a lifetime membership. Free of charge. For you, for your friends. Anything." Arthur looked at the envelope but didn't take it. "I don't want your money, Mr. Thorne. And I don't need a free membership." He turned back to his drink. "I just wanted a quiet place to watch." The simple, honest statement was more cutting than any accusation. Marcus stood there, feeling the full weight of his failure. He hadn't just been a bad host. He had violated the sanctity of a man's peace. "What can I do to make it right?" Marcus asked, his voice pleading. Arthur was silent for a long time. Then he turned, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "You have a gym full of young people," he said. "You have a responsibility to them. You're teaching them a sport. That's fine. But you should also teach them the truth. Teach them discipline, humility, respect. Teach them that the most important fight is the one you walk away from." He paused, then added one final thing. "And fix the anchor on the heavy bag in the back corner. It's been loose for a month." With that, he turned back to the bar, the conversation over. Marcus walked out of the VFW post and into the bright sunlight, feeling like a different man. He had gone seeking absolution for his business, and had instead received a lesson in being a better human being. He now knew what he had to do. It wasn't about saving his gym's reputation. It was about rebuilding it, from the foundation up, on a set of principles he had long since forgotten. The transformation of Apex Striking Academy did not happen overnight. It was a slow, quiet sea change, beginning with Marcus Thorne. The day after his visit to the VFW post, he arrived at the gym before dawn. The first thing he did was take a pry bar and remove the gaudy, neon Apex sign from the main wall. He left the hooks in the brick, a stark reminder of the superficial brand he was tearing down. When the trainers and members started arriving, they found the gym subtly altered. The deafening electronic music was gone, replaced by the low, ambient sounds of training. The rhythmic snap of jump ropes, the steady thud of gloves on leather, the sharp exhale of breath with a well-thrown strike. The atmosphere was no longer that of a nightclub, it was a workshop. Marcus called a mandatory staff meeting. His tone was devoid of its usual sales pitch energy. It was somber, direct, and honest. "Things are going to be different around here," he announced. "We've been selling a product, not teaching a discipline. We've been building social media stars, not martial artists. That ends today. From now on, our focus is on fundamentals, on respect, on humility. Anyone who has a problem with that can find another place to work." The change was most visible in Leo. He became the living embodiment of the gym's new philosophy. He took it upon himself to mentor the younger, newer members, the ones who, like him, had been seduced by flashy techniques without understanding the foundation they were built on. He'd watch a teenager practicing a clumsy spinning kick and would gently intervene. "Hey, hold on," he'd say, his voice quiet and encouraging. "That looks cool, but let's work on your basic roundhouse first. Get the power and balance right. The fancy stuff comes later, or maybe not at all. What matters is what works." He would then spend half an hour patiently guiding the student through the proper mechanics, his instruction stripped of all ego. He and Sarah developed a quiet partnership. They would spar for hours, not as competitors, but as students, pushing each other to be better. They analyzed each other's movements, pointed out flaws, and celebrated small breakthroughs. The rest of the gym saw their dynamic and learned from it. The toxic, competitive energy that had once dominated the space was slowly being replaced by a culture of mutual improvement. Marcus, meanwhile, continued his atonement. He had a crew come in to repair and upgrade all the equipment, starting with the heavy bag anchor in the back corner. He drove back to the VFW post, not to see Arthur, but to speak with Frank, the bartender. He made a substantial, anonymous donation to their benevolent fund, enough to help several veterans who were struggling. He then established a new policy at his gym. Any verified military veteran could receive a lifetime membership, free of charge. He wasn't just apologizing with words. He was making amends with actions. A month after the incident, the last vestiges of the old brand were gone. The gym was now simply called Thorne's Martial Arts. The name was simple, honest, and humble. It was a promise. Colonel Miller visited Arthur at the post one evening. "You should see that gym of yours now, Artie," he said, a note of amusement in his voice. "It's like a monastery. Quiet. Focused. That kid, Leo, moves like a different person. Grounded. Efficient. And the owner. I think you might have saved that man's soul." Arthur just nodded, taking it in. He had heard whispers from Frank about Marcus's donation, about the new veterans program. He had hoped the lesson would stick, but he hadn't dared to believe it would flourish like this. "They're teaching respect in there now," the colonel added. "Real respect. The kind you earn, not the kind you demand." The words settled in Arthur's mind. A quiet place. A respectful place. It sounded like the very thing he had been searching for when he first walked through those glass doors. A few days later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur Vance returned. He carried the same faded olive-drab duffel bag. He wore the same worn sneakers. He walked with the same slow, deliberate pace. But as he pushed open the door to Thorne's Martial Arts, the feeling was different. The air was still thick with the smell of effort, but it was clean, honest sweat. The sounds were the pure, unadorned sounds of work. He walked to the front desk. Marcus was there, not on his phone, but watching his students with a focused, paternal eye. He saw Arthur, and his expression was not one of panic or fear, but of quiet, profound relief. He gave a simple, respectful nod. Arthur nodded back. No words were needed. The apology had been made, and it had been accepted. Arthur didn't go to the locker room. He walked to his old spot, the wooden bench in the corner that offered a view of the entire floor. He sat down, placed his bag beside him, and he watched. He saw Sarah, her movements now sharp and confident, her defense impeccable. She was teaching a new female member the exact footwork he had shown her. She was passing the lesson on. He saw Leo in the main ring, sparring with a formidable-looking heavyweight. But Leo wasn't the same fighter. The peacock was gone. In his place was a craftsman. He used no wasted motion. His head was constantly moving, his feet perfectly positioned. He controlled the center of the ring not with aggression, but with superior tactics and timing. He absorbed a heavy body shot, grunted, and immediately answered with a crisp, three-punch combination that drove his opponent back. It was smart. It was disciplined. It was effective. At the end of the round, the bell rang. Leo and his partner tapped gloves, a clear sign of mutual respect. Leo went to his corner, taking a long drink from his water bottle. As he wiped his face with a towel, his eyes scanned the gym. And then he saw him, sitting on the bench in the corner. A still, quiet figure. The janitor. Leo froze. His trainer started to give him instructions for the next round, but Leo didn't hear him. He just stared at Arthur. Then, he did something that silenced the entire gym once more. He stood up straight, walked to the absolute center of the ring, brought his gloved hands together in front of his chest, and gave Arthur a deep, formal bow. It wasn't a gesture of surrender. It was a gesture of profound respect, the kind a student gives to a master. Sarah, seeing Leo's action, turned and saw Arthur. She stopped her instruction, put her hands together, and bowed as well. Her student, seeing her, did the same. One by one, like a slow, silent wave, the other members and trainers noticed. They stopped what they were doing. The heavy bags ceased their rhythmic swinging. The jump ropes stopped their whispering hiss. A deep, reverent silence fell over the gym. From every corner of the room, people turned to face the old man on the bench and offered a quiet bow of respect. Marcus Thorne stood by the front desk, watching, his eyes glistening with emotion. Arthur Vance sat on his bench, surrounded by the silence. This was not the stunned, fearful silence of his last visit. This was a silence of honor, of gratitude, of understanding. The young black belt who had ridiculed him as a joke had just led the entire gym in a tribute to him. The man who had only wanted to be invisible was now seen for exactly who he was: a teacher, a protector, a quiet pillar of strength. He had walked in seeking peace from his ghosts. By confronting one final battle he didn't want, he had inadvertently built the very sanctuary he was looking for. A small, slow smile graced Arthur's lips for the first time. It was a smile of acceptance, of contentment. He looked at the faces before him, young, strong, respectful, and he gave a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. The ghost was quiet. He was home. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.